tomorrow instead of 20 years from now.
Oh.
The great Oz has spoken.
Oh.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Hey everybody, this is Pete Meyer, technical editor from Motor Age Magazine. Welcome to After Hours. Our guest today is Tony Martin. Tony Martin is one of our contributing editors and an accomplished technician in his own right. In addition to that, he's also an adjunct professor at the University of Alaska Southeast. He's coming all the way from Juneau, Alaska. Tony, how you doing today?
Doing good. Just to be clear, that's associate professor.
Okay, well, we'll give you a little more credit than we know. We know you're worth the full professorship. So.
Come on now, Pete. Come on.
We're going to spend some time tonight talking with Tony, or he's going to be sharing his extensive knowledge on diesel technology and diesel service. I, for one, will admit that I am pretty back on my diesel technology. Most of the shops I've worked in had very little call for that, but diesels are becoming increasingly popular. So it is a great service area to be involved in. If you're not, hopefully Tony will solve some of that for you and give you some pointers as the night goes on. Before we get to that though, first Tony, let me share a couple of things with the guys who are watching. If you have seen our webcast in the past, let me pull this up so you'll have the link. We are kicking off the 2012 webcast season for Motor Age with a Timken sponsored webcast on February 16th. Everything you ever wanted to know about tapered bearings. And I'm sure that I for one never considered, Tony, that tapered bearings are a precision part and often get less than precision treatment, you know, out there in the bay. So we're going to spend some time talking about how to take a look at one to see what caused it to go bad, how to make sure the new one that you're putting in doesn't suffer the same fate, and some other tips and techniques on that. Again, just like our webcast from 2011, there is no cost to attend, but you do have to register, and that's the URL you register at. So grab that, click on that, and get yourself registered, you know, for the webcast on February 16th. Another thing I want to mention here before we get started, very proud to announce that we are taking our relationship with TST one step further. Motor Age will be the lead sponsor in their 9th annual big event training event being going on in March. It's a single day event. If you're in the area of the Ramada Conference Center in Fishkill, New York, then we certainly invite you to join us in person. That's usually where the best learning takes place, right, Tony? You know, when
Yes,
you're in a group.
You can say that for sure.
So, yeah, if you can join us, that's great. But you know what? If you can't, you can still participate by logging in and viewing us online as we simulcast the event, you know, from the Ramada Conference Center up in Fishkill. You can get more information at the link there at motorage.com/big event, and it'll tell you everything about it. So, now we got that. I think we're all good and clear to begin. Tony, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me give you a heads up on firing up your slides. Fellas, let me start it up for Tony and zoom you in so you can see well. And there we got a big close-up of Tony.
Okay.
Waiting for your PowerPoint.
Skin hue there. That's very good.
Yeah, let me get your presentation up there. There we go. Okay, Tony, you're off. Tell us everything you know about essential diesel service.
Well, this is going to be short if you put it like that. I'd like to put in a plug for February's issue of Motor Age because there's actually, I think, Pete, going forward, where February's issue is going to be dedicated to diesel service. Isn't that correct?
That's very true, guys. And in fact, if you've been with us for a couple of years now, you know that we are one of the few that feature a diesel-themed issue, as well as a focus on hybrids and diesels and Europeans and, of course, the domestic and Asians. So yes, our January was on hybrid. February's going to be focused on diesel. Got some really great stuff in there that'll hit the shops about mid-month.
Yeah, so some of the information I'm going to be talking about today is contained in an article that we just finished up and is going to press right now called Essential Diesel Service. And that's the basics of what we're going to be covering today in this webinar. Thank you guys very much for turning out for this. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Pete and all the folks at Motor Rage for having me. It's certainly an honor to be here, and thank you guys for that. But I guess we'll move to the first slide there, Pete. And one thing that I usually like to point out to people as, when we start talking about diesel, start talking about gasoline engines, is that I don't know if you guys have noticed, but diesel engines and gasoline engines are becoming basically one and the same. It's happening. And compression ratios, diesel engine compression ratios are coming down, gasoline engine compression ratios are going up. We've got gasoline direct injection, which effectively is a diesel style technology. And one piece at a time, basically the diesel engine and the gasoline engine are merging is what's happening. If you guys get looking at the slide that Pete's got up on the monitor right now, and it's not real high resolution, but basically if you were to take away the diesel injectors and the high end, basically you'd be hard pressed to tell that that was a a diesel engine that you're looking at. With the diesel common rail system looking so much like, the gasoline direct injection, all of the controls are basically the same, so the inputs, the sensors and things, very, very similar, and the controllers and such. So anyway, over time, for you guys who have any, would you say, hesitation about the idea of learning about diesel technology, but, I don't know much about that, never worked on one before, well, the technology is headed in your direction. Okay, so it's getting friendlier all the time for you guys that, haven't got any diesel experience, want to get some, or thinking about it. So let's take a look at our next slide, because on this one, basically, diesel engines now, pretty much across the board have gone to direct injection. That wasn't always the case. We had pre-combustion chambers in many of the original diesels that were, sold here in passenger car diesels here in the United States. And everything now is pretty much direct injection. And so basically the injector is putting the fuel directly into the combustion chamber. And more often than not, those are 4-valve engines that we've got. The injector's typically in the center. That one you're looking at is a 2-valve, but most of them now are 4 valves. And glow plugs on direct injected engines. That wasn't common years ago, right? Typically the time you saw glow plugs was going to be in pre-combustion engines, pre-combustion chamber engines. And now across the board pretty much, not every motor, but many of them, direct injected engines, diesels, are using glow plugs in a direct injection configuration. So turbocharging is also across the board. There isn't anybody now who isn't turbocharging. It's a complete no-brainer kind of benefit type of technology. And you're seeing that. EcoBoost is a really good example of the gasoline engines that are using turbocharging to their advantage. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Pete.
Gotcha.
As we talk about, the basics of diesel engine service, we got to talk basics, and we have to talk about clean air, because diesel engines pass through, pump more air, much more air than any gasoline engine. And the reason for that is because they don't use a throttle plate to adjust power and output and RPM and so on. Okay, basically they're an unthrottled engine, and the way that the engine is governed is through fuel delivery. So every stroke that the diesels, every intake stroke is taking a full big gust of air, and that same gust of air is being compressed. Basically, we're moving a tremendous amount of air through the engine. So you have to pay very, very careful attention to the air filter and the induction system, making sure that we don't have leaks. And, things have changed quite a bit. Years ago when I was an apprentice technician, we used to be, go to the next slide, Pete. We used to be kind of cavalier about that, didn't pay that much attention to it, to our detriment, because basically, even small leaks in the diesel engine induction system are going to, allow a lot of dirt through. And naturally, that's going to erode turbocharger blades, that's going to, create tremendous cylinder liner wear, and so on. And effectively what it's doing is it's called dusting your diesel. And a dusted diesel is effectively destroyed.
Yeah, I got to admit, Tony, real quickly, I was actually enamored by that term, dusting the diesel. That I never even thought about that. You don't, on gasoline engines, it's not as critical, but I guess it's a really big deal.
Yeah, and it's important on any engine. I think we're agreed on that, right? You need clean air in any engine, but just the sheer volume of air that's moving through a diesel makes it critical that the air induction system be in good shape and doing its job.
Sure.
Now, on the next slide, there's a couple tips on here.
There you go.
The key thing is, don't over-service the system. You've typically got, on a lot of pickup diesels anyway, you've typically got an air restriction gauge on there. And that air restriction gauge is going to give you an immediate visual indicator of what the condition of the air filter element is. So if you're paying attention to that, pretty much every time you lift the hood on a diesel engine, you should be taking a look at that air filter restriction gauge. Now, your customer may come to you with a light on the dash, right, with the air restriction gauge light on. And if that's the case, you definitely have an air filter that needs to be serviced. But like I was saying, that's something you want to pay attention to every time you're doing an inspection under the hood. And just generally looking for damage and leakage, obvious damage and leakage every time. You got to be diligent about that. Certain vehicles, diesel engine vehicles, have not had particularly robust components used for the air filter housing. And in those cases, you may look to getting an aftermarket replacement in certain situations. But again, you need to have clean air going into that engine. Go ahead and let's look at the next slide here.
Next one up.
And the air restriction gauge, pretty basic deal, is basically a vacuum, vacuum gauge is what it is. And there's a yellow plunger inside the thing. As your air filter restriction increases, you're going to be developing a lower pressure downstream from the air filter. So consequently, the plunger is going to move in the direction of the air inlet, or the air ducting that's attached to. And what the air restriction gauge does is it's basically measuring the peak restriction. So in other words, what you're going to see indicated on there is the most restriction it's seen during the normal operation of the engine. And it's going to hold that basically, okay? It's going to, whatever the peak restriction was or the peak reading, it's going to maintain that. So as the air filter continues to get, filled with dirt and so on and creates greater restriction, that gauge plunger is going to rise. And then eventually, it'll rise to the point where, in this case, on Ford, there's a sensor that's tripped and turns on the light in the dash. So let's look at the next slide here.
There you go.
Take a look at the bottom of this one, and the slide is going to show you basically there's a reset button on the bottom side of this thing. And so trip that after you service the air filter assembly. I don't recommend ever blowing out an air filter and reusing it. On one hand, that looks like value. I will say that the engine components and the engine itself is expensive enough, it's not worth it. And even if an air filter element sets you back $70, that's still better value than trying to blow out and reuse an old air filter element. All right?
Now, Tony, what if you got some guy at the local Jiffy Lube or Quick Lube place, and he sees the plunger close to max and hits the reset without replacing the air filter? What kind of situation will that cause?
Well, just that, the thing is going to operate again. I mean, it's going to, measure the restriction, the peak restriction, regardless, okay? But, the guy's going to have to be running the truck at full load or whatever to be able to get it to repeat that. Just resetting it is not doing anybody any good,
Sure.
Obviously. So if you see it nearing the max on that thing, yeah, definitely get in there and replace that filter element. while you're there, clean out any debris that managed to make its way into the system, and also take a real, especially in wintertime, take a real careful look at the inlet, feed, the air feed going into the air filter, and make sure that there hasn't been any opportunity for trash to be picked up, or sometimes snow and ice will collect in bad weather and such. In the shop, you're not likely to see that, but just make sure that you've got a clear passage there on the inlet to the filter as well.
Yeah, that's something hard for us Florida guys to remember, the snow and ice that gets into these intakes.
Yeah, keep in mind, we've had a lot of snow here in the Gulf of Alaska this winter, so that's maybe why I'm talking about that. So. All right. So, next page, we're moving on to diesel engine oil.
Yep.
And, we're going to talk a little bit about coolants tonight. We're talking about, all the basics, engine oil included. And what I call old school diesel service, which is on the next slide. And when you see the slide, basically what this is the attitudes that we used to have at one time. When I was a technician, as long as the oil had the correct viscosity, I typically didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the API quality rating of that oil. And for the most part, you probably got it pretty close to correct. But I got to tell you right now that the API quality rating on engine oil, there isn't a lot of margin for error. There isn't any really. It's at the critical level now. It was important before, now it's critical.
Yeah, and I should just like to interject here too, Tony. It's not just diesels that's important on. It's just as important for the gasoline engines.
Yeah. So there's less margin for error. The engines are fussier in terms of what you're putting into them. So you need to pay attention to this. If you take a look at the next slide, usually the vehicle is going to have a very overt marking on it telling you what kind of oil it wants. This is just an example, 6.4 liter Ford Power Stroke, and they're telling you right on it you need CJ4 motor oil. So pay real careful attention to that. Viscosity obviously is very important in really cold weather. The vehicle manufacturer is going to have some recommendations on maybe an alternative viscosity if you've got really cold weather you're dealing with. However, for the most part, a lot of diesels, 15W40 they're using, but the CJ4 is critical, and the reason it has to do with the additives that are in the oil. When you're, a certain amount of the oil is going to migrate out of the engine, it's going to go out the exhaust, and when it's a certain amount of that oil is going to burn, and then there's parts of it that won't burn, and the parts that won't burn are the additives. And the additives usually are metal-based, or some of the ones are metal-based, and they collect as ash in a diesel particulate filter. So if you're using a previous blend of oil, say like a CI4 instead of a CJ4 when you need it to be, you're probably going to see your diesel particulate filter collecting ash on a much higher rate than it would otherwise. So next slide, just looking at current practice, we kind of moved on through this already, but anyway, some of the additives that we've used in the past that were very common even in gasoline engine oils, phosphorus, right? ZDDP was an anti-wear additive which included phosphorus and zinc, and basically CJ4 API for the first time ever, right, came out and said, hey, we can't just tell you how to make the oil perform. We're actually going to have to tell you to limit certain kinds of additives. And phosphorus is one of them. Another one is sulfated ash. We used to use a lot of that to maintain reserve alkalinity, to basically neutralize acids. And they've had to limit that too, because same thing, it doesn't burn and will collect in the diesel particulate filter.
Now let me ask you, Tony, is the CJ4, is that backwards compatible to older models?
Yes, so basically, the API donut on the side of the bottle will tell you that, but generally speaking, EGR diesels, that's around about 2003, we started to see diesel engines with cooled EGR. A little bit before that actually, but they came on strong about then, and CI4 was the motor oil that they specified for use in those motors, but CJ4 is backward compatible with CI4, right? So you probably won't be able to find too much CI4 around anymore anyway, but something to pay attention to. So next slide, moving right along.
There you go.
Some manufacturers have tighter specs than just the API CJ4 rating. and have very, very narrow specifications on what they want to see put into their motors. A couple of examples: Mercedes 3 liters that you see in the Grand Cherokee diesel, also being used in obviously Mercedes. Let's see, where else have they used them? Oh, Sprinter vans, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, those motors, they're calling for a specific type of motor oil, right down to a specific brand even. And if you look at Volkswagen TDI, there are other motor oils that will meet the Volkswagen spec, but they're fairly few and far between. So I guess what I've got to say is that there may be times that you're going to have to go to the dealer for your motor oil, just depending. Okay, just be aware of that. Pay attention to the spec that the manufacturer is calling for, and be prepared to make a extra trip to buy your motor oil, possibly at a dealer. So.
A quick question for you there, Tony. We have one of the guys online asking about backwards compatibility. He says, what about the engines, the older engines that are reliant on the phosphorus and zinc? Wouldn't it still hold true that you should stock the older formulations and use those as well?
Well, I guess my attitude is, drain intervals are going to be an issue. Obviously, the CJ4 is not going to have as much reserve alkalinity as CI4 did. If you could get CI4 and keep it on the shelf, I'd say do it for these older motors. Otherwise, you may be adjusting drain intervals, right? Mm-hmm. Just depending. So in other words, you may have to change the oil a little bit more often than what you would have otherwise. But I look at the API donut, and if it says CJ4 and if it says CJ4, CI4, CI4 plus on it, I take that to basically mean that it is backwards compatible, and you can be using the CJ4 in those motors.
And then even the much older diesels that still use like the Rotella and all, they can still use that, correct?
Yeah, and that's a challenge. There's been very, very few diesels built, with flat tappet cams and things like that.
Uh-huh.
There's some out there, but they're fairly few and far between. Roller lifters have pretty much been the norm for the most part.
Gotcha.
So, I guess I'd be looking at doing a little bit of research on your own. I don't have an answer for specific motors. There may be some technical service bulletins out there for some older motors, possibly. But
very good.
Yeah. So take a real careful look at what the spec is for the motor, the specific motor that you're dealing with, and then take a careful look at the API donut on the side of the bottle of the oil you want to use, and see if there's any compatibility there at all.
Right.
So
good.
Missed fueling. Big problems. Big problems. Diesel engines are running quieter all the time. And next slide. It's getting fairly common it has been common for some time for people to just plain put gasoline, completely forget they got a diesel engine under the hood and put gasoline in the thing. Now your response as a technician is going to have everything to do with what happened after the fuel was put in. For instance, if the guy didn't touch the key, suddenly realized, he's putting gasoline into his diesel engine, he filled the tank, and suddenly realizes he hasn't put the key in, but he suddenly realizes what he's done. You may be able to get away with just flushing out the tank, and not have to do too much more than that. If you take a look at the list there, it'll give you a bit of an indication of what you need to be doing. But just turning the key to the run position is going to start pumping that gasoline through the diesel injection system on the low pressure side. Just turning the key to the run position. We're using electric pumps in most of these vehicles now.
Right.
So the moment you turn the key to the run position, now the game changes. Now you're going to have to go further. You're going to have to flush out the lines. You're going to have to change the filters and drop the tank probably and clean it out. You're going to have to be very, very thorough on that and make sure you get as much of the gasoline out as you possibly can. The trouble with some vehicles, and I'm going to use Volkswagen as an example, is they use a positive displacement pump in the tank. And that one does not like gasoline. I can tell you for sure that if that's run for any length of time with gasoline in the fuel, the pump piles up. And then pretty quick, that debris goes downstream into the injection system.
Wow.
So bad news. That's real bad news, But But again, if the car has been started, then you're going to have to be, go that much further, right? And if the car has been run for any length of time at all, you may be looking at changing high pressure injection pump injectors, and trust me, you don't want to go there, okay? Exceedingly expensive. And the customer, I can tell you for sure, you're going to have a hard sell for your customer. They're going to want to sell the car. They're not going to want the kind of money that we're talking about, okay? So anyway, yeah, you're just going to have to pay attention. Try to get as much of an indication of what is exactly happening. Now the car, if the car has been running with gasoline and comes into the shop and they haven't even noticed that they put gasoline in, but the car still runs, but it doesn't run good. Okay, well, obviously the whole system's been contaminated. You're probably changing out most of the high dollar parts in the injection system. Just be aware that a diesel engine, well, is going to run on gasoline. It's not going to run good, but may even turn on a check engine light and stuff. But you may, if you go to the next page, or next slide there, Pete, okay?
All right, hold on a second.
I
think I went too far.
Yeah, fuel sampling tips, okay? If you suspect, the customer hasn't said to you what they've done as far as gasoline, and they haven't realized what they've done. The car comes to you with a drivability problem, and you suspect there's gasoline in the fuel. I personally have had some trouble just smelling the fuel and knowing for sure there's gasoline in it. Some of you guys might be in a different situation. You might be better at that. Here's what I do. I keep a bottle, like a drinking water bottle that's got fresh, clean diesel in it, and I take a sample from the vehicle in another water bottle, and I just go back and forth like this, and you'll be able to tell right away if you've got gasoline in the fuel. Another way to do it, take a sample, put it into a styrofoam cup. If there's more than 50% diesel fuel in that fuel sample, the bottom of that cup is going to dissolve, like soften up, and the cup is going to collapse in on itself in fairly short order. If there's less gasoline in there, it's going to take longer for it to have an impact on the styrofoam cup. But regardless, I think what I would do is take 2 styrofoam cups, clean fuel in one, clean known good fuel in one, the fuel sample in the other, let them sit for an hour and just compare. And you'll be able to tell right away what's happened with the misfueling. And then of course you get to sell some fairly high dollar, if indeed there's gasoline and contamination in the fuel, your customer is going to be spending some money at your shop. There's no question. Okay. So let's move on here. Fuel filters. Years ago, used to be really common practice. It was common practice. I used to do it myself. Fill the fuel filters before you install them. Did we go backwards?
Right now, I think we're up on the old fuel. Always fill fuel filters.
Okay.
Yeah, we missed one.
Here we go. Okay. So I'm here to tell you, don't go filling your fuel filters anymore. Install them dry. Use an OE fuel filter. The reason I'm telling you this stuff is because the tolerances in the current injection systems, common rail, high pressure common rail injection systems, are such that it cannot tolerate any contamination at all. So you want to use a good fuel filter, OE if you can. And second, install them dry. Use the electric pump in the tank to prime the system. So you're going to use a scan tool. Maybe you can cycle the key. It just depends on how long the pump will run after you cycle the key. But you want to make sure that you're installing those filters dry and then filling them after the fact with the electric pump in the tank. All right? Mm-hmm. Also another thing, make sure you change all the filters. Go to the next slide there, Pete.
Okay, two quick questions for you here, Tony.
Yeah.
Back to the oil change, one of the techs wanted to know what drain interval you recommend. Now, I'm going to try to give this a shot. You tell me if I'm mistaken or not, but I would tend to go by the OE's published service guidelines.
Yeah, that's definitely where you're going to go first. They've got millions of dollars of research into figuring out what's best for the motor. Take a real careful look at what they're recommending in any given situation.
Yeah.
And So yeah, stick with the drain interval that's recommended, by the manufacturer, and you'd be hard pressed to go wrong.
And the second question had to do with contamination, cleaning out the tank. If I'm not mistaken, you indicated that should be flushed with clean diesel fuel.
Yes.
Because the question was, what should it be cleaned with? So that's going to answer that question, right?
Yeah,
For
put a couple
fishbone.
gallons of diesel fuel in there and use that for the flush to, after you've completely emptied the tank out as best you can. Put a couple gallons of clean diesel in there, kind of thing, and try to finish the job using that.
Okay, and another wants to ask, why again do you install the filters dry?
You're doing that because when you fill the filter, you are creating, not many you'd be able to do that now anyway, okay? But when you fill the filter with an external container of diesel fuel, you don't know for sure, the integrity of the diesel fuel that you're using, whether or not it's been contaminated. So my point is this, is that you're going to install the filter dry, and then you're going to use the electric pump in the tank to prime the system and push the fuel through the filter and make absolutely sure that that's filtered fuel that's going to make its way to the injection system.
Gotcha. Okay, so you don't know if something you might have had in the tank could have been contaminated or debris in it or who knows what, and you don't want to take even the smallest chance of getting that into these injection systems.
This would be during normal service.
Gotcha.
Okay, this would be during normal service. So you're changing out a fuel filter, right? Resist the temptation to fill the filter to try to prime the system.
Sure.
We did it all the time years ago, but the systems at the time were a lot more tolerant to, a certain amount of contamination, and they just aren't anymore. That's all there is to it.
Well, that should cover your fuel filter R&R current practice slide, right? So that brings me to the photo of the HFCM.
Right. So underneath the driver's side on a 6.4 liter power, on a 6 liter, same place on the 6 liter, you've got the 6 liter power stroke, you've got the horizontal fuel conditioning module. It does a lot of stuff. It wears a lot of hats, okay? It's got a fuel pump in there, it's got a water separator in there, it's got a fuel warmer in there, and there's also a drain typically for the water and that collects in the system. Now, diesel fuel has a natural affinity for water, right? And it's going to pick it up over time. It doesn't come that way from the refinery, so it's during distribution and storage that it picks up the water. And you need to be paying attention to getting your fuel from a reputable source, typically at a source that's moving a lot of fuel, right? Okay, so in other words, you want good throughput, not much opportunity for fuel to sit around and collect water. And then what you're going to want to do once a month, is my recommendation, right, is drain the water separator. And that's easier on some vehicles than on others. On the Fords, you're going to have to climb underneath the truck. You're going to have to open up the, on the 6.4, it's not too bad. There's a little yellow handle that's on the bottom side of the horizontal fuel conditioning module. You can open that and drain the water separator. On a Cummins, it's quite a bit easier. That's under the hood, okay, so that's a little easier to deal with. But regardless, once a month, get under there and do that. Get that taken care of. And do it for your customers. Customer's diesel truck comes in, write it down on the work order. Tell them you did it for them, kind of thing, right? And encourage them to do it once a month themselves. Water and fuel is not a warrantable item, right? So
and you made a very good point too, that sometimes the water and the fuel sensor does not catch that.
That is true. And there are documented cases where I've seen it myself, where the water and fuel light did not come on. Everybody was waiting to drain the water separator. They were going to wait for the water and fuel light. And I say don't wait. Be disciplined once a month, drain that water out of the water separator, and you can save yourself some serious headaches.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you're working on the car for a customer, don't rely on the TPMS. I like to tell you when the tire's low, check the tires when you have it in for service. If he's a diesel customer, do the same thing. Do him a favor. Give him the benefit of your professionalism and drain the water for him while he's there.
Yep, tell him you did it. Put it on the
absolutely.
report. Tell him it's part of the service.
Absolutely.
And, they will thank you for it, especially if they talk to a friend who's had water in the fuel and had a failure in the injection system as a result of that.
Yep.
So, next slide, Pete.
All right.
Here's another view of that same 6.4 liter Power Stroke fuel conditioning module. And it's a lot easier to drain the water on this one than it is on the 6 liter. But again, the primary fuel filter, that's a 10 micron unit. The one that's further upstream is a finer filter than that. Okay, so when I was talking about fuel filters, make sure you're changing all the fuel filters. Sometimes the temptation, or maybe you just don't know, there's a fuel filter up top, you didn't realize there's one along the frame. Make sure to change both. A lot of kits you buy, they're going to have 2 filters in them anyway, okay? And you're going to go wonder where this one goes. So change both the filters. Next slide.
There you go.
And what you're going to see then, the secondary filter on 6.4, for instance, okay, changes out up top. It's a little easier to get at, obviously. It's right out in the open. Again, put it together dry, right? So install it dry, put a little bit of motor oil on the O-ring that's on the cap, install it dry, and then cycle the key. You might have to cycle the key a number of times. When you cycle it, you should get about 25 seconds or so of fuel pump operation. And if you want to be absolutely sure you're not going to have a problem, hook a fuel pressure gauge up to the fuel pressure port that's on that cooler, on the fuel cooler. Mm-hmm. And just watch for fuel pressure to come up once you're, and once it has, then you know the system's primed. If you got any doubt, hook up a scan tool, run the fuel pump for a couple of minutes, and you should be in pretty good shape at that point. All right. So next step.
Coolant service.
Coolant service. So old school diesel service. Okay. We used to spend some time working on cooling systems, but we really, I'll speak for myself, I didn't have any idea how important it was. And I got to tell you, it used to be important, and now it's critical. And there's just really no room for fooling around on this, okay?
Yeah.
A, using the correct coolant. Let's go to the next slide.
Hands up.
Okay. Yep. Using the correct coolant, the recommended coolant. They all cost close to the same now anyway, right? And if you can get pre-mixed, that's great. That saves you a little bit of trouble, because ordinarily if you're mixing your coolant, you're going to want to use distilled water. If you get any guff from your customer, well, they're paying $15 to $18 a gallon for the coolant. Another $1.50 for your distilled waters is cheap insurance, to say the least.
Yes.
But yeah, so let's put it to you this way, okay? The newer pickup diesels, and I'm going to use the 6.7 liter Power Stroke, the 2011 Ford Power Stroke as an example. Ford's not fooling around with this, okay? The truck is going to tell you when to take the vehicle in to get coolant tested. And basically it's going to give that reminder to the driver, and the driver is going to be reminded again and again and again. It's every 15,000 miles or so. When the vehicle goes into the shop at the dealer, they're going to use a test strip setup kit, and they're going to test to find out what the condition of the coolant is. If the coolant shows it in the test process, there's a revitalizer that they can add to the coolant to bring the corrosion inhibitors back up to speed. That can be done a couple of times. Eventually, the coolant has to be changed out. But, I get thinking about some of the old dirty buckets that I used to drain coolant into and then pour that same coolant back into the vehicle, And I get thinking about, the kind of cavalier attitude that I used to have about coolants in terms of, how long they're good for. And, hey, it's not brown, it's still green, it should be good, right? Mm. Well, it just doesn't cut it anymore. That's all there is to it. The money's, it's too expensive and too intolerant of shoddy work practices in that regard.
Yeah. Again, same on the gasoline side. This is
absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely. Next slide is going to summarize that quite nicely for us. It's our last slide tonight. Volkswagen TDI. There's been a fair bit of confusion over time, the last number of years, because they've had a number of different coolants that they've introduced. Okay, there's been G11, G12, G12 Plus, and then of course the latest stuff is G12 Plus Plus. And a lot of people are confused about, what coolant am I supposed to use in my particular vehicle. The last two, G12 Plus and the G12 Plus Plus, are very similar colors, so it's kind of like, well, I don't even know what coolant is in the car. right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's what you need to know. First of all, you can get good information at vwparts.com. They've got fluid capacity charts that are there that can help you figure out your mixing combinations. But a good rule of thumb with the TDIs is you can use G12++ to top up anything. The difference is that when you mix it with other coolants, the coolant corrosion protection reverts to the older coolant. Does that make sense?
Yes.
In other words, it'll still work, but your corrosion protection is less than optimal.
Right.
So Volkswagen's recommendation is that in those situations, flush the system completely and fill it with G12++ and distilled water. And you're going to have maximum coolant protection, corrosion protection, and do yourself a favor. One last thing I'd like to mention, G12++, it does mix with G11. It can be used in G11. It's going to turn it brown, and you're going to freak out, okay? That's considered normal, believe it or not.
Gotcha.
Okay? So don't worry if that happened, but at the same time, my recommendation would be to use G12++ only in any TDI, okay?
Right. Okay. Well, Tony, I know we got a class that you got to go to. Let me see if we can back this out so we can all say thank you very much. Here we go. Isn't that cool? I don't even have anyone operating the camera for me. I know you got a class to teach. Guys, we can't sign up too long. Are there any quick questions that you have for Tony before we move on? Of course, you can always join on the AutoPro community. Tony's as a member there. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer any questions that come up. Check out his 2 features in the February issue on diesel service for this and a lot more. And we also have a dedicated TDI webcast that Tony did for us last year that you can find online at the AutoPro community. Okay, well, if that's it, Tony, hey, I really want to appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us tonight and sharing your knowledge. We'll go ahead and let you get to class. And,
well,
thanks
thank you
again.
very much for taking the time tonight, and for all you guys that signed in. You can take a look on search autoparts.com, and there's a certain amount of blog material there. Look for, one thing I would like to point out is that sometimes the feature articles that are in print have pieces cut out of them to fit. So there's going to be more information in the online version than you'll find in the print version.
Absolutely.
If you're used to reading the print version, make sure, if you like an article, make sure to read it online, and there may be more information there.
Absolutely.
That got cut out for whatever reason. Okay.
And so I got one last question. I want to get this out because this actually happened to my son. I know a lot of these guys are doing high performance mods, and one of those is eliminating the EGR system. That has got to cause temperatures to go through the roof.
Okay, I need to hear that question one more time.
Okay, what problems will you get from plugging the EGRs, disabling the EGR systems?
Check engine light.
Yeah, for one, isn't that going to kind of drive exhaust gas temperatures up through the roof?
Well, you know what? I got to tell you guys that I'm not a big fan of tampering. I know that's not a popular answer, right? And I recognize that, you know, for guys that are big on chipping their trucks and things like that, there's a fairly serious downside of doing that. You're going to potentially void your powertrain warranty. Whether you know it or not, a lot of scan tools now can actually tell whether or not you've been reverting calibrations. In other words,
yes.
You know, for guys that have been, you know, running a chip, and then when they take the car in, or the truck in, I should say, for diesel engine service at a dealer, they revert back to the original calibration. Well, guess
yes.
what? GM, for instance, with the Tech 2, can tell if you've done that, okay? And they've got, it'll be there right in color right in front of them.
Right.
And they're not real, you know, they're a little sensitive about that these days.
I keep in mind too, one thing I'll let it here, and we're going to let Tony go. You know that it is against the federal law to tamper or disable an emissions component.
Yeah, I got to say that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's illegal. As far as downside, performance downside, there's lots of people that claim they've got bigger performance and very little downside from doing stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, we won't advocate it. Off-road use only. And with that, Tony, we're going to say goodnight. Thanks again for coming. We'll let you get to class. Guys, thanks. That's all the time we got for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Sorry about the little technical hiccup, but thanks for hanging in there with us. We're going to see you in 2 weeks when our guest is going to be Scott Brown from IATN. He's got a lot of new stuff on the website that we can't wait to show you, not only for your member benefits, but if you own a shop, it'll help you get new customers. So until then, Pete Meyer, Motor Age Magazine. See you next time.
Thanks a lot.